networking for cybersecurity actually. So this is going to be an introduction into developing a good understanding on networking and how to build a good foundation of knowledge about network technologies and protocols being used today. And we'll at a later lesson we'll look at how and what role networking plays in cybersecurity and information security. So hope you guys will learn something new today and in the next lessons to come. And let's move on, right? So I think the first thing that we need to look at is the introduction of to networking and what exactly is a network, right? So we can describe a network. A computer network would be a connection of two or more computers connected to each other and communicating with each other by a common medium. And a network doesn't necessarily have to be made of computers, right? Computers communicate servers agricultural equipment industrial equipment IoT devices web servers all of they communicate over a network and create a network. And there are many technologies that are being used today to allow this communication and to create networks. And devices can communicate with each other using various mediums, right? There are wired ones, like twisted pair cables, coaxial cables. Coaxial cables are not being used that much today. That's an older technology, but still in some specialized cases, they are being used, and fiber optic cables that are used for long distance communication. These things are very common being used. And radio frequencies, right? Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, mobile like GSM, LTE, 3G, 4G, and even 5G today, and many more technologies or mediums that are being used for communication. And even light is being used for communication. As you may know, infrared and even visible light can be used for communication. So I've just put the radio spectrum as an example of to give you guys an idea. Many different bands are being used for many different things for communication purposes. So there are many technologies that are being used, and there are many specialized cases. I think radio spectrum is being closely overseen by governments and other entities, because we can't really use any frequency that we want, right? So those are things that we have to take into consideration, right? So what's the importance of networks and connectivity? That's another thing that we have to discuss, because networks and communications allows people to connect and communicate with each other. And today, regardless of where you are in the world, you can communicate with each other, right? Instantaneously you can call them, right? You can have a video calls, instant messaging, WhatsApp, Telegram, methods of communication, instantaneously communicate. I think this is not just in our personal lives, right? Businesses, government entities, and many other entities rely on communications and network in order to get things done. So we can say that communication is of utmost importance to every facet of our lives, right? වෙන මොකුත් ඕනේ නැහැ. ඔයගොල්ලන් ගෙදර තියෙන ඉන්ටර්නෙට් කනෙක්ෂන් එක නැති වුණා කියලා අපි අමෝරාගෙන යන්නේ. ISP ඩයලොග් හරි SLT ලා ගන්න මේක වැඩ කරන්නේ කියලා කම්ප්ලේන්ට් කරලා මොනවා හරි කරලා ගන්න. ඉතින් ඕක බිස්නසස් වලට නැත්තම් ගවර්න්මන්ට්ස් වලට ඔයිට වැඩි critical, right? If you look at a business, if we lose connectivity to internet, sometimes our services are hosted on cloud, right? Our email is using internet connectivity, And loss of that service can be critical to our organizations, right? අපිට connectivity නැතිව සමහරලාට sale එකක් නැති වෙනවා වෙන්න පුළුවන්. නැත්නම් critical information එකක් එළියට අපිට communicate කරන්න බැරි වෙන්න පුළුවන්. නැත්නම් information එක ආපහු අපිට ලැබෙන්නේ නැති වෙන්න පුළුවන්. ඒ ඔය වගේ හේතුකින්ද අද වෙනකොට network connectivity කියන්නේ it's critical, right? And one other thing that this network connectivity allows us to do is knowledge sharing, right? අද වෙනකොට දැන් මේ session එක අරගෙන බලන්න. අපි වෙලාව ප්‍රශ්නයක් නෑ. වෙනදා අපි ඉස්සර නම් 9ට ක්ලාස් යනවා කියලා හිතන්නේ නැහැ. නමුත් අද වෙනකොට ඒක කිසි ප්‍රශ්නයක් නෑ. very convenient, right? අපිට ඒ වගේ we can access so much information. The world is at our fingertips කියලා කියනවා. ඕනම ඉන්ටර්නෙට් එක තුල ඕන තරම් දේවල් ඉගෙන ගන්න පුළුවන්, right? ගියාම ඕන තරම් tutorials තියෙනවා, educational videos තියෙනවා, ශිල්ප සාගර ෆවුන්ඩේෂන් එකගේ ඕන තරම් resources තියෙනවා අපිට පාවිච්චි කරන්න පුළුවන්. ඒක තමයි instantaneous. මම අර කලින් කිව්වා වගේ අපිට බලන් ඉන්න ඕනේ නැහැ ඉස්සර. මම හොඳ උදාහරණයක් කියන්නම්. මීට අවුරුදු 30කට 35කට විතර කලින් වගේ මිනිස්සුන්ට මොබයිල් ෆෝන්ස් තිබ්බේ නැහැ. ටෙලිෆෝන්ස් තිබ්බෙත් නැහැ ගෙදරට. මොනවා හරි කමියුනිකේට් කරන්න ඕන නම් රට ගිහින් කෙනෙක් ඉන්න නෙමෙයි මේ රටේ ඉන්න කෙනෙක්ට. ලියුමක් ලියලා ස්නේල් මේල් මුද්‍රයක් ගහලා තැපෑලේ යවන්න. එහෙම නැත්නම් ඊට වැඩි ඉක්මනට යවන්න ඕන නම් තැපැල් කන්තෝරුවට ගිහිල්ලා ටෙලිග්‍රෑම් එකක් යවන්න ඕන. ඒගොල්ලෝ කෝල් එකක් දීලා අතන අර පුද්ගලයාට ළඟම තැපැල් කන්තෝරුවට ටෙලිෆෝන් එකකින් ඒ මෙසේජ් එක යවලා එතන ඉඳගෙන කවුරු හරි ගෙනින් පැය ගාණක් යනවා ඒත් ඒ කමියුනිකේෂන් එක යන්න. ඉතින් එතන ඉඳන් අපි අද ඇවිල්ලා තියෙන තැනට කොච්චර දියුණුවක්ද, right? ඉතින් ඔය our need for communication and connectivity that's never going to change, right? කවදාවත් දැන් ඉන්න තැනින් ආපස්සට යන්න කැමති නෑනේ, right? දැන් අපේ ගෙවල් වලට ඇවිල්ලා fiber connectivity කියනවා 100 Mbps. No one's going to say that we don't need 100 Mbps, let's go back to ADSL, right? Let's go back to dial-up. No, never, right? I don't know. 100 Mbps, now let's go for 1 Gbps, right? That sort of thing. So there's always going to be important, and even in another 100 years, we don't know what the world's going to look like in another 100 years, but connectivity and communication will always be there. Right? We will always need it. It's part of the critical infrastructure and it will always be there, right? And another critical importance, let me give you another example. Think about something like a disaster, right? Like a flood or a fire or a landslide. Something happens and the communication lines break down. One of the first things that we do is re-establish communications, right? We need to establish communications because we need to know how to coordinate humanitarian efforts, right? Because without that communication, we can't coordinate with each other, right? Or another disaster, satellite phones, satellite internet, telephone lines, establish business lines, re-establishment of communication. ඒ වගේ මම හිතන්නේ ඔයගොල්ලෝ නිවුස් බලනවා සමහරවිට දැකලා ඇති යුක්‍රේන් versus රෂියා war එකේ Ukraine uses Starlink internet in order for their warfare, right? In order to communicate from the front line and the commanding. They use Starfield because I saw an article where they have said that without that internet communication, sometimes it would take up to 3 hours for them to convey those messages back to their commanding officers. And that's unacceptable, right? So, like I said, so it's of utmost importance to our lives, right? And the concept of global village, I think you all have heard about it. ලෝකෙමාර එකම village එකක් වගේ වෙනවා කියලා අර communication එකේ හින්දා අපිට අර තියෙන distance එක අඩු කරගන්න පුළුවන් වෙලා තියෙනවා, right? ලෝකේ එහා පැත්තේ ඉන්න කෙනෙක් එක්ක උනත් කතා කරන්න ඒගොල්ලන් එක අදහස් උමාර කරගන්න දෙයක් ඉගෙන ගන්න අපිට තියෙන හැකියාව සෑහෙන්න වැඩි වෙලා තියෙනවා මේ communication and connectivity හින්දා. ඒක හින්දා තමයි networks කියන්නේ වැදගත් වෙන්නේ, right? the next slide. Okay, networking and internet plays a critical part in every facet of our lives. Like I said, in our work, right? So communication for in every industry and even in something like agriculture. Other වෙනකොට agriculture ගත්තත් ඒක network connectivity communication කියන එක ඕන. In our daily lives, communicating with our family members, with our friends, with our relatives, it requires communication and connectivity and play. And in entertainment, internet plays a great role, right? Whether it's online video games or streaming, we are creating new entertainment methods and new modes of entertainment consumption, right? New VR worlds, virtual reality, like Meta's Horizon Worlds. I can't remember the name exactly, and learning, right? We are using internet to learn. There are new methods of learning. There are so many new ways that you can learn, and you can learn at your own pace, right? දැන් මේ ලෙක්චර් කියලා මේ වෙලාවේ මේ ටික කිව්වා මේ ටික කියලා ඉවරුණා ඒ වුණාට ප්‍රශ්නයක් නැහැ දැන් රෙකෝඩින්గ్ එක තියෙන රෙකෝඩින්గ్ එක බලන්න. නැත්නම් ඔන්ලයින් තියෙනවා ටියුටෝරියල්ස් තියෙන සයිට්ස් ගිහිල්ලා සයිට් එකට රෙජිස්ටර් වුණා රෙජිස්ටර් වෙලා do it at your own pace. So ඔයගොල්ලන්ට අර ක්ලාස් එකේ ෂෙඩියුල් එක ෆලෝ කරන්න ඕනේ නැහැ. හවස නම් ඉගෙන ගන්න ඕන හවසට ඉගෙන ගන්න. උදේට නම් උදේට ඉගෙන ගන්න. ඉතින් මේ වගේ new modes of learning new කියන්න බෑ මේ දැන් එනකොට නම් දශක එකමාරකට කාලයක් විතර ඒක තිබිලා තියෙනවා නමුත් අතීතයත් එක්ක බැලුවම අපිට we had to go to libraries to get books and to get new information. Now it's at our fingertips, right? So that's why this is important. Now, if we look at the historical evolution of communication, we have come a long way. Right? Now, earliest humans used some things like cave paintings to convey messages, convey meaning to others, right? And humans have used primitive methods like bonfires and smoke signals and fire signals in order to communicate to other humans at distances, right? And we have, with the invention of printing presses, humans have been able to convey messages, to communicate to the masses, right? මුගක් මිනිසුන්ට අපිට communicate කරන්න පුළුවන් හැකියාව ලැබිලා තියෙනවා. ඉතින් like written communication methods කියන ඒවා හිතන අවුරුදු 10 ගානක් පරණ method එකක් ඒක ලොකු ප්‍රමාණයකට to reach a larger audience that was allowed by printing presses, right? And we then moved to telegraphs, right? The first undersea cable, right? Atlantic cable was actually established in 1850s, I believe. I can't remember the exact year, but this allowed for communication at a greater distance, right? Using Morse codes. Now, imagine in a world where someone had to physically deliver a letter or a message, going from that to a telegraph, where electronically you'd be able to send a message over maybe hundreds or thousands of miles, right? That's a great leap from those previous communication methods, right? And then we moved on to telephone, right? Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone and then opened up a whole new world of communication, right? And that was back in 1876, and that was a long time ago. And that changed everything, right? And from then on, I think in 1970s, internet was born, and that changed everything. Now, if we look at, okay, let me go to the next one. If we look at communication, right, we can categorize it based on the direction of the data flow, right? the most simple method is simplex. In simplex mode, only the sender receives information and another party receives that information. They don't have any capability of communicating back to the sender, right? I think the best example of this is the television, right? If you sit in front of a television, even a live cast, you can watch that event, but you can't communicate back at those at the other end, right? You can receive that information. It comes to you, but in simplex, there's no way for you to communicate back to the other side. In half duplex, this is a bit more enhanced than simplex, right? Direction of flow of data flows both ways, but only one side can communicate at a time, right? So if you have A and B, A can communicate and B is going to listen, and B can communicate and A can listen, but they can't communicate at the same time. That's half duplex. And full duplex, the ones that we're using today, is both parties can communicate at the same time, right? The network devices and phones or computers that we have today, the network cards all work in full duplex by default. You can revert back to half duplex, but what's the point, right? You're kneecapping your performance. So those are the three methods of communication based on the direction of data flow. Now, if we look at the internet is the biggest network on earth, right? It's a global network of interconnected computers and devices that allows for sharing of information and resources, right? And no one owns the internet. The internet goes through almost every country. I think even in North Korea, they have internet, but it's extremely controlled. And normal people can't access it, but every single country is connected nowadays. And internet is what has allowed us to get to the current level of increased level of sophisticated communication that we experience today, right? And internet is, we can describe internet as the backbone for the exchange of data and information in the whole world. And this is physical infrastructure that's made up of millions of servers, routers, switches, and other many different networking devices that spread all across the world. There are many data servers, many different ISPs, many different cable lines that span the entirety of the to allow this communication. And it's using a wide variety of technologies, right? And for long distances, we are using fiber optic cables, and there are satellite links. And like I've said before, something like Starlink that's being used. And there are many other wireless communication methods that are all used to establish this communication, right? And if you look at the history of the internet, it can be described as a result of gradual development rather than a flash of inspiration. Because when you think about the telephone, like I've said in a previous slide, it's been attributed to Alexander Graham Bell in 1878 or something. And in that instance, as the telephone is established, unlike that, internet is more of a gradual development and can't be attributed to a single person. It's actually the work, the research of many different people. And one of the most prominent aspects or subsets of the internet is the World Wide Web. Now remember, the internet is not the World Wide Web. Those are two different things, not two different. Well, like I said, World Wide Web is a subset of the internet. The internet is a physical infrastructure, and the World Wide Web is accessible through web browsers, right? Like for Chrome, Firefox, Safari, and others. And it's built on HTTP. So when you access web pages and web applications through a web app or through your browser, they are stored on servers, and those are served to client. That's the World Wide Web, right? And this was invented by Tim Berners-Lee in 1989, and public access was granted in 1991. And this opened the floodgates to information, right? This is the moment when everything changed. And nowadays, internet is an integral part of our lives, right? It revolutionized information access and sharing. And one other important aspect that you guys need to remember is that no one owns the internet, right? There's no single entity that controls the entirety of the internet. That doesn't mean that vast swaths of it is controlled by different organizations like ISPs and large conglomerates. But no one owns the entirety of the internet, right? And the internet has, like I've said, provided some great opportunities, but it has also allowed for propagation of threats, right? The viruses, ransomware, and all the nasty stuff that we are seeing today, unfortunately, came as a result of the internet. It allowed bad actors to reach their victims through the internet, right? Even if they're on the other side of the world, through internet, they can access and hack someone else to gather information, to steal data, to destroy data, and impact others and harm others. Some really, really interesting ways, right? And there are so many different threats and novel methods that hackers have used to hurt others and to hurt organizations, to steal data, to steal information for financial gain or otherwise. And nowadays, even governments are involved in this, right? There are information cyber warfare happening. And actually, the internet is another battleground today where governments are using this freely available access to do some really, really interesting stuff, right? To carry out attacks. Even nowadays, it's possible to carry out attacks against critical infrastructure, right? There have been instances where government entities, organizations who have taken out power. I'll give you one example where Russia hacked Ukraine's power grid and turned off power to some thousands of people, all through networks, right? Through internet. They've accessed them, they've hacked their grid and turned the power off. And those kind of attacks were never not possible before the internet, right? There are so many more examples that I can give, but time being what it is, I don't think we can go into a lot of detail regarding that today. But let's go and look at the history of the internet. Like I've said, in the 1960s, so when internet started in its infancy, right? The US Department of Defense research project called ARPANET is where it all started. And ARPANET sent his first message for typing just login in 1969. And internet, as you know, as I have described before, is interconnected networks, and TCP/IP protocol, which we will go into at a later lesson, is the foundation of the internet. We'll go into detail of TCP/IP because these protocols are very important, because those are what allows us to use those mediums to communicate, because we need these protocols in order to communicate. Those are kind of like the language that we use in order to communicate, right? We need a language in order to communicate with each other, and the network devices that we use and the programs that we use those communication protocols in order to communicate, right? Or to facilitate communication. And DNS, domain name system, was introduced. We'll get to it later, but technical, very simply, it's if you type in something like Google or Yahoo.com or something like that, you're always using DNS because we use something called IP addresses, just numbers, in order to communicate each other, because computers don't understand human language, right? You can say google.com to a computer, that it would automatically understand it. We need that DNS system in order to convert that into numbers, in order for the computer to be able to communicate and get that information, to make that request to the web servers in order to get that request. And like I've said before, Tim Berners-Lee invented World Wide Web. And in the 1990s, that's when the internet became widespread. I don't think most of you wouldn't, I don't know whether you have been around 90s, but that's when internet first came out, and there were dial-up modems where we would use the phone lines in order to communicate. It was really, really slow. And in late 1990s, this World Wide Web led to a dot-com era and the dot-com bubble that burst, right? And businesses were very interested, very keen on using internet. Everyone wanted to get on it, to use that new technology to find bigger markets, bigger market share, to find new revenue streams, but it ultimately crashed, right? And Web 2.0 is what we call social media and user-generated content. Web 1.0, I think we'll cover that in a later lesson as well. But for the time being, to briefly explain what it is, Web 1.0 is what's the early internet, right? Where you would access static web information, right? Web servers that had static information. If you go to Yahoo or any other site, and they had some content on there, and you looked at it, and that's it, right? It was merely a method of conveying information. There was nothing for the user to input. But in Web 2.0, user-generated content is king, right? If you go to YouTube or Facebook or TikTok or Instagram or whatever, you can see the platform is there, but the content that's on there is actually generated by users. The users are what's giving those platforms value, right? And there's now Web 3.0 coming along. I think we'll go into more detail in a later lesson. For the time being, let's move on. In around 2010, I think smartphones and mobile internet access has skyrocketed, and nowadays I think smartphones actually are more prevalent than computers these days, because many people are using smartphones in order to access the internet. And as of right now, there are more smartphones and mobile phones on Earth than people. So that's not going to change anytime soon. And today, there are about 6 billion people. Even now, I think around 75% of the entire global population are actually connected to the internet. And this is projected to grow to 90% in like 2030 to 7.5 or 8 billion people. So it connects billions of people and transforms communication, commerce, and our daily lives. So this is an overview of the internet, right? And if we look at the internet, the it can be divided into three distinct sections, right? The surface web, the web that can be easily accessed, right? Like Wikipedia or Google or other websites actually made up around 4% of the entire internet, right? Most of the internet can't be accessed by surface web because if you look at the vast majority of the internet is actually deep web. Now, deep doesn't necessarily mean that it's inaccessible and locked away in some secret location. It means that you need authentication in order to access that information, right? I mean, think about it. If you want to access Wikipedia, you can just type whatever you want into the search and go and access that information. No problem, right? But if you needed to access some organizations' internal systems, right? Let's say a bank's online banking system, right? You can't just access that information, right? It's reachable via the internet. You can reach that, but you can't access those internal information. Yeah, think about it. I mean, things like Amazon Web Services or Google Cloud. There are many cloud service providers that provide cloud computing resources to many business organizations. So they have their entire business applications on the cloud instead of on-premise on a data center. And this can be accessed by anyone, right? Technically, they can be accessed by anyone. But to gain access to those systems, you need authentication, right? So most of the internet is in the deep web. And there are web crawlers that are used by these search engines in order to index the internet. So whenever you type something into Google, the search results are found actually by their web crawlers. They would crawl through the web and find the content and index them and rank them. That's how the Google search or Bing or other search engine search results work. But the problem is they can't crawl those deep websites. They can't just go into, let's say, People's Bank. They have their internal web systems, right? Internal banking systems. They can't just go in, okay, I'm from Google, I need to crawl through your entire system. No, they can't do that, right? So deep web is what's the majority of the internet is made of. And deep web is what most attackers would be targeting too, right? If there's a banking system or another medical records or other maybe educational entity, and attackers may want access to that, right? They would steal credentials or trick some organizational employees in order to grant them access to them. Now, like I've said, on the internet, you can reach anyone from anywhere, right? So that's how attackers gain access to these. What I'm saying is at a very high level. I'm not going into much detail regarding any of this, but I hope that this gives you an idea, an appreciation for the complexity and how deep it goes, right? And last but not least, there's the dark web. This is not accessible through typical browsers. We need a specialized browser called Tor. And there are sites that are, unlike surface websites, these are hidden networks, hidden websites, right? These are used by many malactors as well as legitimate people as well. Tor can be used for circumventing government oppressive actions, right? If your government has denied access to internet, you can use Tor in order to circumvent that. And but dark web is most famous for being used by cyber criminals. Whenever we talk about ransomware attacks or any other data stealing attacks, all that information typically shows up at the dark web being sold by someone. Not all of them, but at many times, even in a ransomware message, if you have ever seen a ransomware message, there would be an onion link that goes to a dark website there where they will give you advice on how to pay and get your data back, right? So dark web is something that that's being used by these different parties for nefarious as well as legitimate purposes, right? So this is a cable map, submarine undersea cables that communicate, that allows communication around the world. So like I said, this is how communication between countries is established. This is essentially how a vast majority of the internet communicates with each other, right? Let me just show you this site for a minute. All right, let's go to submarine cable map, right? And as you can see, there are many different submarine cables. These are what allows communication between countries, right? If you look at Sri Lanka, there are many different submarine cables that are being used. These are what allows us to communicate with other countries. Now, these carry hundreds of gigabytes or even terabits of data actually. And these cables are what allows this global network to operate. Now, some people initially think that most of the internet traffic is carried through satellites. Well, that's not true. The vast majority of internet traffic is actually carried through these submarine cables, right? So hope that makes some sense and give you an idea and appreciation for how complex these networks can be, right? So yeah, so that's the end of today's lesson. I wish to keep it brief and short because I don't think we need to go into too much technical details on the first day because we have time and there are a lot of ground to cover, but there's no need to go everything in the first day. So I hope you guys learned something new. Hope you guys gained some new insight into network communications and how it impacts our lives, how it is an integral part of our lives and part of the world, right?
Can I
So
ask, can people can ask any questions? Amal?
yeah, go ahead.
For them, I will just get started. Thank you very much. It was a very interesting first
Yeah, absolutely.
lecture. Just let me know now, in the context of Sri Lankan internet,
Yeah.
and what is our situation? How many that kind of users? How secure? And what we are using and sort of things. If you can elaborate on Sri Lankan context of the internet, Lankawa ගැන?
Yeah, absolutely. I think even if you look at, I don't actually have the numbers for how
I
many
think we
subscribers
have
are there.
about 6 million odd users.
Internet users, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
with regards to the security and the services,
Yeah, absolutely. I think when it comes to information security and the investment of infrastructure, Sri Lanka is still behind other countries, right? We're still lagging behind. If you look at something like new trends like 5G, we are still lagging behind other countries there, and that should be expected. I mean, we are not a vastly wealthy country, and we are not going to be able to invest those sort of money into infrastructure and sink money and gain those
Another
newest.
question,
Yeah,
just to get the thing interesting.
yeah.
What kind of jobs available for a person who studies networking?
Well, there are actually a lot of jobs, and I think most people would think that network engineer would be the only path that you can take, but that's not true. There are many other paths you can take, and one thing that I would like to add to this discussion is that there's somewhat of consensus, even when we were learning networking, and even when we were doing BCS. One of the things that people tend to do is you either go into networking or you either go into programming or software engineering. But the thing is, the industry is very vast and it's changing, right? Now there are DevOps and DevSecOps, and there are many other different things. And even when it comes to security, there are many sides of the industry that we can focus on, right? When it comes to auditing, when it goes to banking side of things.
Now,
yeah.
I'm just asking question after but to make it interesting.
Yeah.
Now, if you take networking as a subject, connecting things and make them communicate, how important that knowledge for any technological person, because now homes are becoming smart homes.
Yeah,
So is
absolutely.
it only professionals or should everybody learn networking?
Absolutely, that's a great question actually, because regardless of what you are, where you are in information tech, especially if you're in IT, having that foundational understanding of networking gives you a good insight into how technology operates, right? Basic understanding of how technologies work, how computers interact with or communicate with each other, gives you a great leg up in my opinion and in my experience, because otherwise people tend to run into trouble because they don't understand how the communication part of the networks work and communication part of the computers, and uh, that understanding can be very important and very insightful, because when you are working with other people.
People are talking about these IoTs and a connected world and all. Do you really think the world will be fully connected?
To a certain extent, I think it would. I think I don't think it would be right for us to predict how it's going to be in the next 10 or 15 years. We can't exactly predict how it will be, but I think we will see more connectivity. I mean, even now, IoT devices and smart homes and even things like critical infrastructure are being connected and brought online because convenience factors, right? Because efficiency, those are things that we have to work at. And if we can establish better communication, faster communication, that's always going to work in our advantage. So, absolutely, that's going to be a major factor in our lives in the coming decades.
Okay, thank you. We have almost come to the end of today's lecture.
Yep.
Shall we ask from our participants sort of a feedback? ඔයාලා මේ lecture එක ගැන අපිට feedback එකක් දෙන්න. කතා කරන්න ඔයාලගේ ideas, what you learned and any feedback. Please, Ammar Ghani, he's one of my students. Ammar Ghani, give me a feedback, please. Anyone else?
Sir,
Okay.
this introduction session was very helpful to understand the basics of networking. And finally, the Sri Lankan networking part had cleared many doubts. Thank you.
All right. Thank you everyone for joining today's session, and hope you guys learned something new. So let's meet next week, right?